All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the plenary session 2 of the first annual Eastern Medical Research Conference, a joint meeting of the ESPR and the AFMR. Thank you for joining us today in support of pediatric and medical research. I'm Jayashree Nair, Chair of the Planning Committee for ESPR and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Buffalo. And my co-moderator is Dr. Hamid Basiri, a brilliant immunologist and assistant professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine and a pediatric infectious disease attending at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. We would like to begin by acknowledging the generous support of this session's sponsors, which is Yale University School of Medicine, the Department of Pediatric Infectious Diseases and Global Health at Yale, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and Mount Sinai Kravis Children's Hospital. For the first part of the plenary session, we have the ESPR Mentor of the Year recipient, Dr. Paul Offit. Besides his invaluable contribution to science, Dr. Offit continues to make an impact as a mentor, reaching his audience in various innovative ways. This week, his podcast titled Scientific Progress, Public Health and Mentorship was released by the Incubator Podcast, an exciting venture hosted by Drs. Ben Koshya and Daphna Yasova Barbu, and is available on various forums as shown in the slide. Now, before I hand over the stage to Dr. Basiri to introduce his mentor, Dr. Offit, I would like to share some guidance for this session. We ask that you do not copy or record the presentation. Any questions may be typed into the Zoom Q&A area. The moderators will ask the presenter as many questions as possible in the specified timeline. And now I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Basiri. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, I want to thank the ESPR and AFMR for this session and for allowing me to introduce Paul. So, by way of introduction, I just want to give a little bit of background about Paul. He pursued his Bachelor's of Science at Tufts University, followed by his MD at University of Maryland. He did his residency at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, and then joined CHOP for his fellowship and instructorship, where he really performed some seminal research with doctors Fred Clark and Stan Plotkin on rotavirus biology and pathogenesis, setting the stage for later development of the rotavirus vaccine. After that, he made a short detour at Stanford, where he continued his research and then returned to CHOP as an assistant professor, joining the faculty, and quickly rising to the rank of associate professor within 5 years and becoming the chief of the division, where he remained at the helm for over 12 years and where he now continues as a full professor and endowed chair and a director of the Vaccine Education Center. To really encompass all of the awards, honors, and attributes that Paul has is really, really, really difficult. He has won awards in teaching, research excellence, scientific breakthrough prizes, clinical care and service honors. And I was forewarned, at the risk of angering Paul, not to delve into these. These take about 7 pages to list on a CV. But I think a few that caught my eye are worth mentioning. So he has garnered the Stanley A. Plotkin Award from the Pediatric Infectious Diseases Society, the William Osler Award from the University of Pennsylvania, the President's Certificate from the AAP, honors from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Distinguished Medical Achievement Award from the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the Maxwell Finlan Award for Scientific Achievement from the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases. He's been elected to the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences and the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. He's won the gold medal from the Sabin Vaccine Institute, the Edward Jenner Lifetime Achievement Award, the Jonathan Rhodes Medal for Distinguished Service to Medicine from the American Philosophical Society. And of course, you probably know he's the inventor of the Rototech rotavirus, along with Fred Clark and Stanley Plotkin. He has published over 90 scientific articles, over 160 chapters, editorials, and reviews, and over 20 books. To say he's been prolific is really an understatement. He has always been a staunch proponent of vaccines and scientific thinking in general, and an outstanding science communicator, disseminating evidence-based medicine to lay people, clinicians, and scientists through a variety of means: lectures, media interviews, web content, podcasts, as we just heard, and perhaps my own favorite, his books. And honestly, if you've never read any of his books, you owe it to yourself to pick one up and do so. There's just amazingly well-written font of knowledge, and you'll be better off for it. But really to set the stage, just a couple of things before I get to some of the testimonials. Under his leadership, our division began to grow in both scientific and clinical scope, as well as size of faculty and fellows. Our faculty research broadened to encompass not only basic science research in virology and bacteriology and vaccine development, but also clinical epidemiology and care of the immunocompromised host. Our division established one of the first antimicrobial stewardship programs in the country, really through the efforts of Paul, which continue to this day through his service on a variety of committees controlling sort of the use and utility of various drugs in the hospital. And now about half of the medical directors and researchers across the US children's hospitals in antimicrobial stewardship can really be trace the roots back to Paul's mentorship. Over the years, Paul has mentored and trained numerous trainees at all kinds of different levels, whether they're graduate students, postdocs, medical students, residents, fellows, junior faculty. And that includes more than 50 fellows as of last year's graduating class, with our fellowship now being ACGME certified for the last 25 years. What I'd like to do next is really share with you a few excerpts from some of the multiple testimonials we received and garnered for Paul's nomination. So I'll start with this one, which comes actually from a junior trainee that states, now as I'm transitioning from fellow to attending and towards becoming an independent physician scientist, Paul has supported my career development by writing in support of my NIHK award. I once asked Paul what I should be doing to advocate for vaccines at this stage of my career, and he told me to work hard in the lab. Having Paul's support for this work means a great deal to me. I can proudly say that I'm a better physician and vaccinologist because of Paul's mentorship. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more dedicated and deserving recipient of the Eastern Society for Pediatric Research Mentor of the Year Award. The next person says, Paul could not have been more supportive of my career, although he was a basic scientist interested in vaccines, and I was a clinical epidemiologist interested in immune-compromised hosts. He never wavered in his support of my efforts, always going out of his way to provide insights on next steps and make sure that I felt well-resourced. While Paul did not directly mentor me in my research endeavors, I learned a ton from his clinical acumen, in particular his ability to break down complex clinical scenarios into discrete and logical decision-making steps. This learned skill set is one that I know I will be grateful for through the rest of my career. Additionally, I've observed him mentor a number of junior faculty in the areas of vaccine and witnessed them benefiting from his vast knowledge base and ever-present willingness to listen and provide guidance. The next person says, what struck me most was his command of both bench science and clinical medicine, his deep passion for understanding of pathogenesis of disease, and the razor-sharp manner in which he dissected the most salient features of complex patient presentations, reducing them into testable binary decision points. To me, at that point in my career, he embodied the very incarnation of what a clinician scientist should be, and he immediately became a role model. And then the final two comments were to state that Paul has had anything short of a significant impact on my training and career path would be an understatement. Yet what makes me particularly proud to have been one of Paul's mentees is the depth of his courage and commitment to educating not only trainees, but also lay people about the importance of scientific inquiry and evidence-based health policy. During a time when it was vogue to vilify the vaccine manufacturers and scientists for thimerosal and vaccines, or the adjuvants, or the number of immunizations, for the false association between the MMR vaccine and autism, Paul continued to serve as a beacon of reason. He continued to give talks, write editorials and books, and incessantly promote understanding of the science, separating facts from fiction, and demystifying and reducing the fear of the unknown. His public opposition to the anti-vaccine movement spurred tremendous vitriol, several frivolous and distracting lawsuits, and even threats against him and his family. And yet, these never deterred Paul from his single-minded mission of disseminating scientific truth. In this manner, Paul has transcended the boundaries of education to encompass not only the teaching and mentoring of those around him, but also the enlightenment of the thousands of healthcare workers and parents who seek the help and voice of science in the care of children. And then the final quote, which is a short one, which really encompasses a lot of what we all feel about Paul, is that it states, Paul claims no personal credit for this level of influence, only admires and champions the mentees who have risen in the field. And I think this is the perfect way for me to sum up how we all feel about Paul, a consummate clinician scientist who has dedicated his adult lifehood to the pursuit of truth and the improvement of pediatric lives, all while training others to do so in the most unassuming way possible. I think that I've spent enough time embarrassing him and would like to now introduce you to this year's awardee of the ESPR Mentor of the Year, Dr. Paul A. Offit.
Hamid, thank you. That is the kindest introduction I have ever had in my life. Thank you. You've made my day. All right, so let me try and share my screen here, and we'll get started. Okay, so everybody can see this okay? All right, so what I want to talk about is I guess what I've learned in some ways about communicating science to the public, both the hard way and the less hard way. But I think that it's now more than ever, we have drifted from scientific literacy into scientific denialism. People simply declare their own truths, like vaccines cause autism, climate change is a hoax, evolution and creationism are equally valid hypotheses, COVID-19 vaccines alter your DNA or cause infertility. And I think as a consequence, science is losing at some level its rightful place as a source of truth. We're just another voice in the room. So I'm going to go through sort of 10 challenges and then talk about how I think there's sort of practical examples for how they can be met. Challenge number one, the scientific method. So in 1998, Andrew Wakefield published a paper in a respected general medical journal, The Lancet, claiming that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine caused autism. Now, the paper, is shown here, was titled Ileolymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia, Nonspecific Colitis, and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children. It really was just a case series of 12 children, 8 of whom had developed autism within a month of receiving this vaccine. It should have never been published. I mean, this was at a level where you could, for example, have 8 children who recently had eaten a peanut butter sandwich and then had evidence of leukemia and published that. There were basically 8 subjects and 13 authors. Just as a general rule for future epidemiologists, you should always have more study subjects than authors. But in any case, this was later evaluated. So when you try and evaluate whether or not Andrew Wakefield's hypothesis was correct, you form the null hypothesis, which is to say MMR does not cause autism. You can do 2 things with that hypothesis. You can reject it, which is to say autism following receipt of the MMR vaccine occurs at a level that is greater than chance alone, or you cannot reject it, which is to say autism following receipt of the MMR vaccine occurs at a level that would be expected by chance alone. And so there were 18 studies done in 7 different countries, on 3 different continents, involving hundreds of thousands of children who either did or didn't receive MMR vaccine, making sure that you controlled for things like healthcare seeking behavior, socioeconomic background, medical background, to show that you were at no greater risk of developing autism if you'd received the vaccine or not. The problem is, however, when you're trying to communicate that to the public, is you can't accept the null hypothesis, which is to say you can never prove that one event could never follow another. You can't say that MMR vaccine does not cause autism because epidemiologic studies aren't mathematical theorems. There are no proofs, just associations at various levels of statistical power. When I was a little boy, I used to watch the television show Superman. This was the one with George Reeve before Christopher Reeve, and Superman flew. I mean, he had a cape. He looked down on the cities below him. His hair flew back, his cape flew back. And, when you're 5 years old watching television, this was in black and white, by the way, TV does not lie. So I went into the backyard and stood on a small chair and put a towel around my neck and tried to fly unsuccessfully. I tried about 5 times. Now, that didn't prove I couldn't fly. I could have tried 1 billion times. That would have only made it all the less statistically likely. This is what you're up against. Where this played out for me was Dan Burton, who was a Republican from Indiana, held a hearing back in 2002 to look at the question of whether MMR caused autism. And there were 2 panels. On one panel, it was Andrew Wakefield, as well as a variety of, frankly, quack pediatricians who were selling autism treatments. And on the other panel was Colleen Boyle from the CDC, as well as me and Brent Taylor, there to talk about whether my job was whether it made biological sense that MMR would cause autism. Colleen and Brent Taylor's jobs were to determine whether or not what epidemiological studies showed. And she was great. I thought Colleen Boyle did as good of a job as you could do trying to explain the science of what was found in these epidemiological studies. But what she never said was MMR doesn't cause autism, because she knew that the scientific method did not allow her to say that. And that made Dan Burton angry enough to start screaming into the microphone saying, so you can't tell me that MMR doesn't cause autism, can you? You've got an out in the back of this thing. That was the quote. Because when you can't say it, it sounds like you're unsure or you're waffling. And so I think what I learned in all this is that don't be verbally handcuffed by the scientific method. I think you just have to be willing to be struck dead by the scientific method gods and say things like MMR doesn't cause autism, because MMR doesn't cause autism and I can't fly, at least not without a plane. Okay, challenge number 2, the soundbite problem. I think this is less of a problem when you're interviewed by newspapers or magazines or even on the radio. But when you're on television, on national television, you don't have a lot of time to explain your point of view. And so you have to be able to contract a lot of information into at most a few minutes. So I'll give you an example. The thimerosal issue, which was an ethylmercury containing preservative that sort of came to a head in the late 90s, early 2000s, when it was realized that as we were adding more and more vaccines to the schedule, there were a number of vaccines, even single-dose vaccines, that contained thimerosal. So what did we know? So as I said, in the late 1950s, parents became concerned that this ethylmercury containing preservative in vaccines caused harm. At the time, it was present in several vaccines to prevent bacterial and fungal contamination. So what happened was, exercising caution, the Public Health Service urged vaccine makers to take thimerosal out of all vaccines given to young children, which was a mistake, frankly. I mean, it was sort of an example of how not to communicate theoretical risks to the public. If you look at the statement that the Public Health Service made, what they said was that all the evidence to date is that the level of thimerosal contained in vaccines is safe, but to make safe vaccines even safer, we're going to ask pharmaceutical companies to remove it. Well, if it's safe, then taking it out doesn't make it safer. It just makes it perceived to be safer, which is a very different thing. So here are the facts. I'm going to give you sort of 9 facts and then tell me how you would try and summarize that into a soundbite. Thimerosal is ethylmercury. Environmental mercury, which can be harmful, is methylmercury. Ethylmercury and methylmercury are different. Ethylmercury is eliminated from the body 10 times faster than methylmercury. Methylmercury is present in anything made from water on this planet, including breast milk and infant formula. The amount of methylmercury in breast milk and infant formula is much greater than the amount of mercury contained in vaccines. That because methylmercury is ubiquitous, all children, including newborn babies, have methylmercury in their bloodstreams. Children injected with vaccines containing thimerosal have levels of mercury in their blood well within levels considered to be safe. And 7 studies at that point actually had shown that children inoculated with thimerosal containing vaccines were not at any greater risk of developmental disorders than those inoculated with the same vaccines that didn't contain thimerosal. Okay, so those are the facts. Now you're on television. What do you say? So you can say babies are receiving much greater quantities of mercury from breast milk and infant formula than from vaccines. Not terribly reassuring. Sounds like we're all caught in this toxic environmental hell. Or you can say studies have shown that mercury in vaccines doesn't increase the risk of autism or other developmental problems, which is better. Or you can say, I think 7 studies have now shown that thimerosal in vaccines didn't hurt babies. But this was hard to watch. I mean, I had to testify in front of a congressional hearing once where one of the congressmen sort of angrily stood up and said, when it comes to mercury, I have 0 tolerance. Well, if you have 0 tolerance for mercury, move to another planet. Because on this planet, there's mercury. And if you've ever testified in front of Congress, you would know that congressmen moving to another planet is not the worst idea. So, lesson 2. It's hard to reduce complex scientific issues into a soundbite. Okay, lesson 3, and this has gotten harder, is getting the public to trust the scientific process. This is really worrisome for me now, just watching how the public really is starting to set aside the communications from the Food and Drug Administration or the CDC. I mean, if we get to the point in this country where we don't trust the FDA or CDC, we're in trouble. But let me go through this. Hold it. Go back to the beginning. Okay, sorry. Okay, here. So this from Edmund Wilson's Consilience. Science is the systematic enterprise of gathering knowledge about the world and organizing and condensing that knowledge into testable laws and theories. That's what science is in many ways, at least in the epidemiological world. It's a matter of controls, a study of controls. So you formulate a hypothesis, you establish burdens of proof, You subject those proofs to statistical analysis. Science includes rigorous controls that allow you to isolate the effect of one variable, which we just showed with the MMR studies. But what isn't science? It isn't scientists, it isn't scientific bodies, it isn't even accumulated knowledge. I mean, we are perfectly willing to take textbooks, throw them over our shoulder without a backward glance as we get more and more information. I can tell you there are several things I learned as fact during my pediatric residency that over time were found not to be true. So it's really a way of thinking about a problem or approaching a problem. Although scientists get it wrong all the time, science is enormously self-correcting. That's good. That's a good thing. That's what you want. You want us to be circumspect. So here's examples of getting it wrong. In 1926, Johannes Fibiger won the Nobel Prize for his discovery that an organism called Spiroptera carcinoma was the cause of stomach cancer, even though that was wrong. In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz won a Nobel Prize for a surgery that he called leucotomy, that he believed treated a number of psychiatric illnesses. When that surgical procedure crossed the Atlantic Ocean into the United States, the name was changed to lobotomy, and we performed lobotomies into the 1970s until we realized that they were cruel and ineffective. In 1957, Ansel Keys, who was a nutritionist that was an advisor to the United Nations, argued that polyunsaturated fats like those contained in butter increased your risk of heart disease, thus driving us into the waiting arms of margarine, which was loaded with trans fats, and ultimately caused Time magazine to change its cover. And then these two men, I don't know if you recognize them, it's Stanley Pons on the left, who actually looks remarkably like Bill Gates, and Marty Fleischmann on the right. These are chemists at the University of Utah who believe that if you took a palladium wire, attached it to a battery, inserted it into heavy water, you could, at room temperature, induce an experiment where two nuclei fuse at room temperature. That also happens on the surface of the sun, where it's much hotter. This was done at room temperature and was given the name cold fusion. In fact, the state of Utah gave millions of dollars to the University of Utah to build a cold fusion research institute. So there's a building that was called the Cold Fusion Research Institute. It's not called that anymore because this was utter nonsense. But again, this got a lot of play and caused people to, I think, question science. And I think the fluidity of science is disconcerting. I mean, I think if you ask people in this audience, do you think we're going to know more about science and medicine 100 years from now than we know now? I think everybody would say yes. But when it comes to your disease or your vaccine, the vaccine that the FDA advisory committee just agreed or approved or licensed, you want to believe we know everything we need to know when that's pretty much never true. We always learn as we go. The learning curve is really never over. But the fluidity of science is disconcerting. It's what I call the Bones-McCoy seduction. Bones-McCoy was the chief medical officer on the USS Enterprise, Star Trek. It was a television show. Ask your parents about it. But what he did was he had this thing in his hand called the tricorder. So if you had various signs or symptoms, he would sort of scan you up and down, and then he would look at that readout. And that's what you had. It's very reassuring to believe that there are absolute truths in the world of science and medicine when that's often not true. Same thing with people like Dr. Oz or Deepak Chopra, who really don't express doubt, or Andrew Wakefield, who continues to go around, continues to believe that MMR vaccine causes autism. And at least for some people, that is enormously reassuring. So the good news is the truth wins out, but it might take a while. Okay, challenge number 4, beware the unanswerable question. So this I think was one of my first appearances on television. It was a local Fox station back in the 90s. When it was September, it was back to school month, and so the producer thought it would be good to have me on the show since I had an expertise, a budding expertise in vaccines. So I went on that show, and what the way they did was they didn't have me sit next to the two co-hosts. Rather, they wanted me in the newsroom. So my back was to the co-hosts. I was on this relatively unstable chair. I had an earpiece that fit badly. I couldn't see the people that were talking to me. There was a show called Ally McBeal, which was very popular at the time, that featured lawyers in Boston, many of whom were women. And the fashion statement at the time was to wear relatively short skirts. So there were several models standing next to me, all in their 20s, all with progressively shorter skirts. And you're thinking, I'm sorry, is there any way, the newsroom is loud, people are laughing and screaming, and you're wondering how you could be any more distracted before you're asked this question. Dr. Offit, could you tell us what vaccines children get, how many they get, and when they get them? Okay, so the actual answer to that question is here. Children receive a vaccine to prevent hepatitis B virus at birth. This is in 1997. At birth, 1 and 6 months of age, the combination DTP vaccine at 2, 4, 6, and 15 months of age, again at 4 years of age, a vaccine to prevent Hib at 2, 4, 6, and 12 months of age, a polio vaccine at 2, 4, 6, and 6 months of age, again at 4 years of age, the combination MMR vaccine at 12 months and 4 years of age, and the chickenpox vaccine at 12 months of age. This answer would probably set healthcare communication back about 20 years. The better answer to that question is here. Children receive several vaccines in the first few years of life to prevent pneumonia, hepatitis, meningitis, and bloodstream infections, among others. Parents should make sure that their children are up to date on their vaccines so they don't have to suffer these terrible diseases. I didn't give either of these answers. I sort of gave a variant of the first answer, but I kind of got lost in the middle in terms of what I was trying to answer. I mean, it was pathetic. It was so pathetic that even the models who were standing next to me just stopped talking and stared at me sadly. It was bad. But let me just, sorry. Okay, so the other question that I've been asked a lot, and because I am at some level a viral immunologist, I've tried to answer it as a viral immunologist would answer it, which was another mistake. But the question that I was asked was, how many vaccines are too many? Meaning, how many vaccines could you really get? It's very hard in the first few years of life to watch your children get vaccines to prevent 14 different diseases, which can mean as many as 27 inoculations at that time. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time. And so a parent can reasonably ask, how many is too many? It is hard to watch all that. Is this too many? So let me just go back. Okay, so I'm not sure why this skips, but so to answer this question in a more practical manner, I sort of looked at the work of Rod Langman and Mel Cohen at the University of Cal San Diego, who are theoretical immunologists who published a series of papers called the Protecton, the unit of humoral immunity selected by evolution. So let's make the following assumptions. An antibody concentration of 10 nanograms per ml is likely to be an effective concentration of antibody directed against a single epitope. The generation of 10 nanograms per ml requires about 1,000 B cells per ml of blood. A single B cell clone dividing every 0.75 days will reach 1,000 cells in about a week. Each vaccine contains about 100 antigens. Antigens defined as viral proteins, bacterial proteins, or bacterial polysaccharides. And each antigen contains about 10 epitopes. So there's about 1,000 epitopes roughly per vaccine, obviously, depending on the vaccine. And there's about 10 to the 7th, so 10 million B cells are present per ml of blood. So if you divide 10 to the 7th circulating B cells per ml by 10 to the 3rd epitopes per vaccine, then each person theoretically could respond to about 10,000 different vaccines at the same time. Now that's not exactly right. What I said was children could probably respond to about 10,000 vaccines, but that doesn't consider the fact that we're constantly making new B and T cells. So it really would have been more correct to say 10,000 vaccines at any one time. In any case, that's a terrible answer. I mean, it creates an image of like children being pincushions. And in fact, what happened to me, oops, come on. And so, well, I became the 10,000 vaccines guy. If you actually probably Google the word 10,000 vaccines, you'll see me come up. People challenged me to take 10,000 vaccines. One blogger wrote that my wife had given me 10,000 vaccines and I'd ended up in the emergency department. And in July 2017, a PR news service declared that I had died after receiving 10,000 vaccines, following which one of our hospital's PR people called me to make sure I was alive. I actually answered the phone, which in theory answered the question, but in any case. So you don't have to answer the question exactly as asked. The other issue is this one, that the media gives voice to the voiceless. This is a Chicago Post reporter who in the early 1900s said that the job of the media is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so that's often how the media sees itself. So, for example, here, Katie Couric, seen there on the right, interviewed 2 women who believed that their daughters had suffered serious permanent harm following the HPV vaccine. And you can see that in the background. It says HPV vaccine controversy. There actually is not a scientific HPV vaccine controversy. This was just a cultural controversy to which Katie Couric gave a voice. Oops. Similarly, Jenny McCarthy got her start as an anti-vaccine activist by appearing on Oprah in September 2007, claiming that her son had developed autism following receipt of the MMR vaccine. I was actually asked to be on this show, and it's tempting. I'm thinking I probably know more about vaccines than Oprah or Jenny McCarthy. Maybe I can go on that show and calm the waters, but that's not the way these shows work. Oprah is there to tell a story. Her story has 3 roles: hero, victim, villain. Jenny's the hero, her son is the victim. This leaves only one role for you. You're the villain. You're there on stage telling Jenny that she's wrong, telling Oprah that she was wrong to have her on the show in front of a studio audience of pretty much 100% women. It's a loser, so you don't go on this show. You think you're calming the waters, but you're not. You're just filling in a role of bad guy. Okay, I guess the TV moment, or frankly, life moment, that I would like to have back is this one. This is the thing, I think, in terms of interacting with the media, that I regret the most. It occurred in 1993 on Good Day, Philadelphia. So it involved Bruce Williams and his 11-year-old daughter, Whitney, who had AIDS. Now, the father believed that Whitney had acquired HIV from an oral polio vaccine. The child had no other risk factors. She was not known to be a drug user. She wasn't sexually active. The father was HIV negative. The mother was HIV negative. Her siblings were HIV negative. Bruce Williams didn't make this up. This had been part of a Rolling Stone article by Tom Curtis titled "The Origin of AIDS. Was it an act of God or an act of man?" It was also part of a book by Edward Hooper called "The River, A Journey to the Source of HIV and AIDS." It surrounded Hilary Kaprowski, who actually was the head of the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia for a number of years, and his work on the oral polio vaccine, which was in the Belgian Congo in the 1950s. The argument in this article and in that book was that the chimp cells used to make Kaprowski's oral polio vaccine were contaminated with simian immunodeficiency virus. That after people were inoculated with that vaccine, that SIV mutated in the vaccinee to HIV. And consistent with this theory, HIV first appeared in the Belgian Congo in the 1950s. Now, none of that was right. Although HIV did mutate from SIV, that event didn't occur in the Belgian Congo in the 1950s. Sort of genealogical studies of the vaccine genome shows that it probably occurred in Cameroon in the 1930s. The Kaprowski's oral polio vaccine wasn't made in chimp cells, it was made in monkey cells. Chimps aren't monkeys, they're apes. And that neither SIV nor HIV were detected by a very sensitive polymerase chain reaction in lots of Kaprowski's polio vaccine, which fortunately he was able to save and therefore was tested during when this book and magazine were published. In fact, there was Stanley Plotkin, my former boss, that Dr. Basiri mentioned, was also asked to testify in front of a tribunal in England to address this issue. Now, I didn't know the source of Whitney's HIV. I only knew it wasn't the source. And the father got angry with me, and I sort of became more insistent. I was frankly upset that the host had given this man a platform for this. He was actually in the midst of suing the vaccine maker of the oral polio vaccine. And angrier still that he used this young girl who was clearly suffering to do it. And I never expressed sympathy for the girl. If I could go back in time, I would like to say, honey, we're all rooting for you. Hang in there. We love you. Something that recognized that this girl was suffering. I mean, this was 1993. This is still about 3 years before the development of highly active antiretroviral therapy. I mean, if you had AIDS in the early 90s, you were in trouble. And that was certainly her story. I mean, she passed away a few years later. The father eventually dropped the lawsuit, by the way, when it became clear how she did acquire HIV, which, when you think about it, is the only way she could have acquired it. So that's the lesson. Be sympathetic, no matter how trying the circumstance. Okay, challenge number 6, avoid the irrelevant argument. So I had to appear on CBS this morning in 2013. That's Nora O'Donnell in the center, Charlie Rose in the middle, and Gayle King on the right. To talk about this book, Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. You know, usually when you are asked to be on national television about a book that you've written, you're ecstatic if the person has read the flap. I mean, usually they've read the title, they've been given questions they ask, know nothing about your subject, but if they've read the flap, that at least shows some level of intellectual curiosity. Gayle King had read the book. I mean, it was sitting in front of her with a series of tabs throughout the book. It was really impressive I was really impressed by her. But in any case, there was a section in the book where I talked about Steve Jobs, specifically about his choice of alternative therapies when he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Now, the pancreatic cancer he had wasn't an adenocarcinoma, it was a neuroendocrine tumor. So he actually had a very high chance of survival, really a more than 90% chance of survival, had he had early surgery. But he chose not to do that. Rather, what he chose to do was to have coffee enemas and sort of multivitamins and fruit juices, and he delayed his therapy, his surgery, to far too long. By that time, it was too late for him to benefit from that surgery, and so he died. I mean, he largely died because of those choices. So Charlie Rose was angry that I talked about that in the book. He said, with respect to you, sir, by the way, sir is never good. Sir is a bad sign. Isn't it dangerous to say, if you never treated a person, what might or might not have been the consequence? I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. I'm saying, realizing I'm now being sort of called to task in front of about 3 million people on national television. In other words, did you treat Jobs? No, I didn't, I said. So isn't it dangerous to suggest what he might have been able to do if you didn't treat him? Now, see, I would argue, this is the straw man argument, which simply ignores a person's actual position and substitutes a distorted, exaggerated, or misrepresented version of that position. So what I did was sort of pulled myself together and said, okay, here's what we know. I mean, it's not just what I'm saying in my book. I mean, Walter Isaacson has written a book about Steve Jobs. There have been many magazine articles about Steve Jobs that have said exactly what I said in the book. Here's what we know. We know this, this, and this. And we know that had he made a different choice, he would have, he had a much better chance to survive. So it doesn't matter whether or not I was his doctor. And you know, so you have to be careful about that because you're often pulled into these other directions. So that's the lesson. Don't go down the rabbit hole. The facts are on your side. Just stick to the facts. Okay, challenge number 7, the scientist's personality. So this is an old joke. How can you tell the difference between introverted scientists and extroverted scientists? When introverted scientists talk to you, they stare down at their shoes. When extroverted scientists talk to you, they stare down at your shoes. I mean, you know, my training for being on national television was largely inoculating mice in a windowless, concrete blocked room at the Wistar Institute. That's really not training for doing things like this, which you learn, by the way, by doing it and making a million mistakes. But it is a different world. If you Google the word scientist and then select images, this is the kind of image you see. So we're much more comfortable sharing and analyzing data in hopes of discerning central truths about natural processes. That's what we're trained to do. When we stand up in front of a group and we present our data, we want those data to be critically analyzed so our science can get better. That's what we want. We're generally uncomfortable when put in positions where you're expected to be dramatic advocates for a particular position. In many ways, our training is the opposite of that. I mean, a good scientific paper is one in which the discussion section is loaded with caveats, because the biggest mistake you can make as a scientist is to ever go beyond the data in front of you. But when you're on a national television show, you are being asked to be an advocate. And so it is at some level at variance with your training. Right, so here's an example of Jenny McCarthy being a powerful advocate in concert with at least a sort of an anti-vaccine pediatrician, which sadly are all too easy to find. And then on the right, you have David Taylor, who at the time was the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, a wonderful man, a gentleman from North Carolina, who was completely out of his element on the show. I mean, you have to... You have to be able to challenge her with and meet her passion and compassion. You have to be able to do that, and it's not easy for us. You can see in his body language here, this wasn't easy for him. Okay, so the lesson here is if you choose to go on these shows, know the rules. Okay, next. Debating an issue that isn't scientifically debatable. So this was in 2015. Amy Goodman asked me to appear on Democracy Now! With a woman named Mary Holland, who's a lawyer and who wrote this book, The Vaccine Epidemic: How Corporate Greed, Biased Science, and Coercive Government Threaten Our Human Rights, Our Health, and Our Children. Not a big fan of vaccines, Mary Holland. So what she said on this show, and I asked not to be on the show with her. What I was willing to do was follow her. I wanted to follow her so I could write down all the things she said and then try and refute them. So she said vaccines cause permanent brain damage, that vaccines compromise the immune system, that the MMR vaccine causes developmental regression, that boys who received the hepatitis B vaccine were more likely to have autism, that children are too young to be vaccinated, that vaccines don't create herd immunity, that vaccinated children are less healthy than unvaccinated children, that before vaccines are licensed, they aren't tested with other vaccines given at the same time, that the hepatitis B virus is only transmitted by sexual contact. So all that was wrong. And to Amy Goodman's credit, she did let me follow her. She did let me write all those things down, and she did let me refute each and every one of them. But at the end, she didn't like it that I had chosen to follow Mary Holland instead of being on the show with her. And she said, I mean, to be fair, we wanted to have both of you together to have a conversation because there are many in this country and a growing movement of parents who are deeply concerned. But you wanted to have this conversation separately, Mary Holland and you separately. So it's important, I think, to have this kind of dialogue on all of these issues. To which I responded, I'm sorry, Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland misrepresented the science again and again and again. I don't think that in any way helps your viewers. I don't think it's fair to have a debate where two sides are represented when only one side is supported by the science. I'd like to think we're beyond that. I have no idea why I said I'd like to think we're beyond that. We're not beyond that at all. I've come around full circle on this. Initially, I thought this isn't worth it because all you're doing is elevating the other person. You're giving them a platform. 5 minutes into the interview, nobody knows who the expert is. They remember the fight more than the facts, and it's not worth doing this. But I changed my mind after this interview because I got a number of sort of emails from people saying, thank you, that helps. That helped me refute these arguments. The point being, you're not really trying to convince Amy Goodman. You're not trying to convince Mary Holland. You're trying to convince the people that are watching that show. And that's what you have to be able to do. Focus off of those people in front of you, which is not an instinct. Oh, come on. So I'll give you a few examples of my heroes in all this. There's Bill Nye on the left, the science guy, debating Ken Ham, who is the head of the Creationist Institute in Frankfort, Kentucky, an institute where if you walk in the front door, you can see a dinosaur playing with a small child, which is interesting since those two species missed each other by about 65 million years. But anyways, I mean, so Ken Ham sort of laid out his reasoning for why it is that one shouldn't stray from the Bible, that if the Bible says that the earth is essentially 6,000 years old, that that's what it is, and that there was a great flood. And what Bill Nye did was he sort of systematically and comfortably showed a 9,000-year-old tree in Sweden. He showed carbon dating studies where you see the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, but closer to 4.5 billion years old. He showed sort of the Grand Canyon, the layers in the Grand Canyon that suggested that there never would have been a great flood because there would have been a mixing of fossils. And it was great. I mean, if you watch this, you really learn from it. And he was doing this at the Creationist Museum. I mean, the people in that audience were not on his side, but he never wavered. Similarly, Joe Schwartz debated Andre Sain, who was a homeopath. And again, if you watch, these things are all available on YouTube. So you can see then how you debate a homeopath. But my favorite, my winner for Bravest Debater Award goes to Michael Shermer on the right, who at the time I think was the editor of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, who debated Mark Weber there on the left at the Institute for Historical Review, which is a Holocaust denialism group. Where you walk in and there's books on Nazism, there's Henry Ford's The International Jew. I mean, that's the group you're talking to. And he was amazing. Again, you can see this on YouTube, where he reads letters in the original German from people, like Eichmann and others, and he translates it: house rotten, extermination. I mean, this whole notion that these were just people who were being congregated for their health was excellent. I mean, so it is worth it, because because these things live on YouTube, and it's a great way, I think, to combat this information. So again, lesson: focus on those who aren't in the room. The other thing is, I think you have to be willing to leave your comfort zone. The comedians have been great. They're skeptics. I mean, they see nonsense and are perfectly willing to make fun of it. There's no better way to dismiss something as being wrong than to make it a joke. As George Bernard Shaw said, if you're going to tell people the truth, make them laugh, otherwise they'll kill you. And I think the comedians have been great. Penn and Teller did a great piece on vaccines. John Oliver's done a great piece on vaccines. I was on the Colbert Report in 2011. The book that he's got in front of him was a book called Deadly Choices: How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All. And he's great, Stephen Colbert. His father was a scientist. His father was an immunologist in South Carolina, infectious disease expert, who died in a plane crash, actually, when Colbert was a young boy. And so he certainly is very much devoted to science and scientists. He meets with you before the show and says, I'm going to play a role. I'm going to play the role of the anti-vaccine activist. Don't let me get away with anything. If you don't challenge me, it's going to be a boring show. And they also, they don't tell you the questions that they're going to ask. I don't know if you can see, there's a little blue card in front of him there, where he has the questions written. And there's about 5 minutes when you're sitting at that chair watching your life pass before you, before he comes to your side there in front of a studio audience of about 300 people. They show you a series of kind of like the do's and don'ts of the Colbert Report. There are several pieces that they show that are don'ts. One of them, interestingly, was Atul Gawande, a brilliant writer, brilliant speaker. He was a don't because he kept coming back to his talking points. You're not there to educate about vaccines. This is an entertainment show, and you're there to be entertained by Stephen Colbert. The other don'ts were making jokes. Don't make jokes. See, when he makes a joke, your instinct is to make a joke back, but you're not funny. He's funny, and that's why the people are there to laugh at him, not you. So those were sort of actually the first thing on his list there was, why haven't you taken off your clothes for Playboy, right? I mean, because that was the Jenny McCarthy story. And I'm looking at my daughter and wife sitting in the front row there thinking, God, don't ask me this question. But in any case, I was on a second time actually with him. And this time he asked me a question, because I was, as Dr. Bissuri said, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital Philadelphia that created the bovine human reassortant rotavirus vaccine, Rototec. So he challenged me with a way in which anti-vaccine activists often challenge me, which is, I'm in the pocket of industry. So he said, it's out there, you're in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry. How do you respond to that? And so I said, I'm not in the pocket of the industry. If anything, at Children's Hospital, we're in the pocket of children because we do this, this, and this. And then the studio audience booed loudly. I'll tell you why in a second. So he's great. He said, okay, remember, this is live to tape, which is sort of like fresh frozen. It's like, it's taped. So they can take out stuff if they want. So he said, that's not the answer you want. Let's try it again. So the second time the second time he gave me a chance to answer the question, I said, you can't on the one hand praise vaccines for being safe and effective, and not at some level praise those who make them safe and effective. And then I did something you're specifically told not to do, which I looked to the studio audience because I was a little angry that they all booed me. And I said, was that any better? And they cheered. So that's actually, if you watch the show, you see me saying something nice about the pharmaceutical industry and people cheering on national television, which has probably never happened before or since. But as I was walking out, I asked the associate producer, why did people boo? And she said, when you said that you were in the pocket of children, it made you sound like a pedophile. Pedophile. I mean, so now I'm in the cab going back to the train station, because this was in New York, heading back to Philly. So I'm with my wife and daughter, and I said to them, would you ever have imagined that? And my daughter said, yeah, I imagined it. That's why I booed. So there you go. So I think the lesson there is swallow whatever residual pride you have left after surviving decades of the NIH granting process and get in the game. Okay, lastly, I think, and then we're finished, I think the last challenge is to tell a story. So Galileo, for example, in the early 1600s, published a monograph about his observations about the phases of Venus, the moons around Jupiter, and hundreds of previously unseen stars in the Milky Way, which he titled The Starry Messenger. What a great title, right? It wasn't like, my observations on the planets. It was as if these planets had a message that they wanted to tell us. He was a good storyteller, was Galileo. Why I keep doing this. Mary Shelley in 1818. In the early 1800s, electricity was popularized in county fairs and expositions. People were amazed when their hair stood on end or when they saw a dead frog's leg twitch. One interested observer was an 18-year-old named Mary Shelley who was inspired by that to write the book Frankenstein. It's alive. And Louis Pasteur, in 1881, separated sheep, goats, and cows at a county fair into two groups. To one group, he gave an anthrax vaccine. To the other, he gave nothing. 30 days later, he infected both groups with anthrax bacteria. All in the vaccinated group survived. All in the control group died. Two right in front of gasps from the crowd. And people like Isaac Asimov, a biochemist, Jacques Cousteau, an oceanographer, Siddhartha Mukherjee, and Atul Gawande, physicians, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologists, Bill Nye, a mechanical engineer, Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking, theoretical physicists, have all been excellent storytellers. And that's what you have to do. Actually, I remember the first time I heard Dr. Fauci speak when I was at a double-stranded DNA or RNA meeting about rotaviruses. He told a story. I mean, at a basic science symposium, he told a story, which is to say anything can be told as a story. So I think the lesson here is you have a good story to tell, so tell it. So finally, I think that it's time to stand up for science. It's not easy. I think we all assume that other people are doing it. They're often not. I think no venue is too small. I mean, my daughter's teacher, when she was in the 8th grade, asked me to speak to her science class about vaccines. There were 20 kids in the class the entire way down to driving her to school. She went to the Agnes Irwin School in suburban Philadelphia. She just kept saying to me over and over again, do not make jokes, Dad. People my age are not going to think you're funny. Trust me on this. And the whole time I was giving the talk, and frankly, this talk in front of my daughter's 8th grade class was the most harrowing experience I think I've ever had giving a talk, because the whole time I'm giving the talk, 19 students seemed to be enjoying it, but one of them had a face that just said, do not embarrass me in front of my friends, because if you do, you're a dead man. So I think we shouldn't let bad information go unchallenged. There's a lot of bad information out there on the internet, and there are a lot of really good people like Dorit Reese and David Gorski and others, Steve Novella, who really are good about getting online and challenging bad information, because that's where this war is being fought now. It's not really being fought in mainstream media, as it was true, say, 20 or 25 years ago, but this is the way it's being fought now. And as a scientist, being funded for 25 years in the NIH R01 granting process, I mean, who paid my salary? It was citizens that paid my salary. It was the voting public that paid my salary, and they could just as easily stop paying it. So I think we have to, this is a privilege doing science, not a right. And I think we have to explain why it's important that we're doing what we're doing. So I'll stop right there and take any questions you have.
Paul, thank you for that outstanding and amazing presentation and lecture. There's so much to unpack in there, and I feel like you could listen to that 2 or 3 times over and just remember the anecdotes, but also the the sort of the answers to the challenges. We do have a number of questions that have come in through the Q&A. I'll start with, actually, this is kind of an interesting one. I'll start with one from Dr. Yan. Dr. Offit, such a great talk. How would you respond to Jenny if she were in front of you right now?
What I would say is, I think that raising the question is fair. As a mother who watched her child get a vaccine and then after that develop signs and symptoms of autism, it is perfectly reasonable to ask that question. The good news is it's an answerable question, and here's how you answer it. And here's how it's been answered. I mean, the fact of the matter is we did respond to that. We didn't just sort of set that aside and say this is just some silly notion that a mother has about what caused her child's autism. The public health community responded, the academic community responded, and spent tens of millions to answer the question, dollars to answer the question. The fact of the matter is, at the time when that issue was raised, The studies were done showing more than 90% of parents of children with autism, when asked the question, do you think vaccines might have caused it, said yes. Now, a recent study done by the Autism Science Foundation out of New York asked the same question, and 85% of parents said no. So those studies do have an impact on people and how. So although, you could argue why pursue this fruitless, dead end, nonsensical hypothesis by spending money doing studies, there is value to that. And that's what I would say. I mean, I think that at this point, to deny that wealth of information is to just deny how much effort was put into answering that question, because parents had that concern.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are at least 3 or 4 questions that sort of are along the same vein, and I'm wondering if you can sort of address this as one main concept. So I'll read the questions and let you respond. So the first is, do you think medical training or scientific training should include training in communicating science to the lay public? The second question is science best communicated to the public by scientists or specific kinds of scientists? So kind of along the same vein. And then should there be a science of storytelling or a science storytelling? So I'm wondering if you could address those, and we'll go on to the sort of follow-up questions thereafter.
So in terms of should there be specific media training, sure. I think that helps, although I will say this, I think you get media training by being in the media. I think what I do if I'm on television or whatever, because with the COVID pandemic, I've been a fair amount on sort of CNN or MSNBC. I usually just tape it and then look at it later and think, I really should have done it this way or that way. I think that's how you learn. You learn by doing it and by making mistakes. It's the way life works in general. In terms of who should best communicate, yes, I think scientists who have an expertise in that field are the exact people to communicate. They're the ones who know the story the best. What they have to be able to do is get past their own jargon. I mean, constantly be translating in your head, how does this sound to someone who has no expertise in this field? And anybody who is an expert, I think, who really knows their subject well, should be perfectly able to do that, to be able to translate that. In terms of sort of I wasn't sure about what the last question meant exactly, but the sort of, is there a science kind of storytelling? No, I think frankly, when you write a grant, you're basically telling a story. You're asking the federal government to give you hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. You better be a good storyteller, because that's the way that you get your money. You have to make what you're doing sound compelling. There, you're making it sound compelling to a group of experts in your field, but in the lay public, you're making it sound compelling to people who aren't experts. But yeah, I think that's completely doable and has to be done by scientists. Actually, when we started the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia in 2000, it was because there was this kind of 1, 2, 3 punch, and I was on the ACIP at the time. Thimerosal hit, MMR causes autism hit, RotaShield, which was a simian human reassortant rotavirus vaccine that was on the market for about 10 months before it was taken off because it was a rare cause of intussusception. That all happened within about a year and a half. And I didn't see the communication there from the scientists who were best able to answer it. The pediatricians were great. I mean, they got out there and they said, vaccines are good, vaccine preventable diseases are bad, I vaccinate my own children. But you really needed scientists there to say, here's why this doesn't make sense. It doesn't make biological sense. Here's what the epidemiological studies teach us. I think we have to do that. We are the ones to do that. And I think the mistake we make, one, is to think other people are doing it, because they're not. And two, to think that it's really not, that it's beneath us in any way to do that. But it's important for us to do this.
Fantastic. We're running up against the hour, but I want to pose one last question, and then hopefully thank you for, again, a brilliant lecture. So the last question states, what helped you stay motivated to go beyond getting burned out from constant public pushback and misinformation?
I think the same thing that drew me to pediatrics. Maybe it's just, I guess we all treat ourselves at some level. I mean, or let me put it this way, that the passions of our childhood are invariably, or the scars of our childhood become the passions of our adulthood. I mean, I was at the age of 5, I was born with club feet. I had an operation on my right foot that was horribly botched. And as a consequence, I ended up in a chronic care facility for about 6 weeks when I was 5 years old, which was a polio ward. So I was, this was the mid 1950s. It's not like they had therapy dogs, iPads and TV. You had one visiting hour a week. My father traveled all the time. My mother had a pregnancy complication with my brother, so nobody visited me. So for 6 weeks, I'm by myself in this hospital, Kernan Children's Hospital, or Kernan Hospital for Crippled Children, because that was back in the days when you could name children's hospital with words like crippled and feeble-minded. So you're there by yourself, and you look at all these children in iron lungs, in traction, for 6 weeks. I mean, you see these children as vulnerable and helpless and alone. And so when I'm in the hospital and I see children come into our hospital with vaccine preventable diseases like flu or chickenpox or pneumococcus or Hib or whatever, because the parent chose not to vaccinate them, I guess at some level I see myself there, and therefore the passion never leaves. And the parents put their child in harm's way because they're getting bad information. I mean, really, really upsets me. And so I'm happiest, frankly, when I get all the hate mail I get from anti-vaccine activists, because I know I'm getting on their nerves. And I'm not a big person. I'm just happy that, I have upset them that much because they've upset me. But let me just say one last thing before we go, because I assume everybody knows the answer to this question. But why did the father drop the lawsuit? I mean, how did that little girl get HIV? The father was negative, mother's negative, sibs are negative. She was sexually abused by the father's brother. That's how she got AIDS. It's just a terrible story. So, in any case, not to completely depress you, but that was that story. But I think so. To end on a positive note, get in the game. I think get in the game. Your voice is valuable. You have an expertise, and you've worked so hard to develop that expertise. I think it's incumbent upon you, a responsibility for you to translate that expertise to the public.
Well, I think on that note, I think we'll end the session. I really cannot thank you enough, Paul, for giving us this great presentation. And I look forward to your future endeavors, your future books, and following you on your podcast as well. So in closing, I wanted to just finish again by acknowledging the generous support of this session's sponsors. Really, without their support, this conference would not have been possible. And at this point, I will end my portion of the moderation and hand it back to Dr. Nair. Jayasree?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Basiri. And Dr. Offit, that was amazing. I think it was, I still don't know that I could do any part of that, but I think it's amazing to hear the story being put together. Also related a little bit to your books is, before we introduce the ESPR award sessions, I would like to announce another result, and that was in partnership with our friends at the Incubator podcast, where we had an exciting swag bag giveaway this past week on Twitter, which generated tremendous interest and participation. And the swag bag actually included 2 of your books, which I think I might cheat, and I'm starting to read. I've gotten through about 1/4 of those before I give it away. It's my pleasure to announce the winner of the giveaway. It's Dr. Khalid Katranji, who's a neonatology fellow outside our region in Peoria, Illinois. So congratulations to the winner. And thank you so much, Dr. Offit, for being here. Please feel free to stay on and listen to some of our science, but this was fantastic. It was our pleasure to host you.